Imagine this, the most powerful man in the world, a titan of industry turned commander-in-chief standing in a courtroom, not as a conqueror, but as a defendant. The walls, once echoing with his booming confidence, now seem to close in on him. His signature red tie feels like a noose tightening around his neck. But this isn't just another legal proceeding. This is personal. The stakes, his legacy, his fortune, and perhaps even his freedom. And then it happens. A single decision by the judge, a misstep so glaring, so reckless that it sets off a chain reaction no one saw coming. For years, Donald Trump has been a lightning rod for controversy, a man who thrives on chaos and emerges unscathed. His supporters see him as a warrior against the establishment. His critics call him the very embodiment of corruption and arrogance. But love him or hate him, one thing is undeniable. Trump knows how to fight. Yet this time the fight isn't on his terms. This time, he's not in control. And that's what makes this battle different. The courtroom is tense, every eye fixed on the man who once commanded the world's attention from the Oval Office. His legal team sits rigidly beside him, their faces betraying nothing but quiet determination. Across the aisle, the prosecution smirks with confidence. They've been waiting for this moment for years, and presiding over it all is Judge Raymond Callaway, a man with a reputation for being fair but firm, or so everyone thought. When Judge Callaway delivers his ruling on a critical piece of evidence, a ruling that many in the room immediately recognize as biased, Trump's expression doesn't change. He doesn't flinch or scowl. He simply leans back in his chair and folds his arms across his chest. But behind those steely eyes is a storm brewing, a storm that will shake the very foundations of this case and leave everyone questioning whether justice can ever truly be blind. What Judge Callaway doesn't realize is that he's just made a mistake that will haunt him forever. A mistake that will not only tilt the scales of justice, but also ignite a firestorm outside the courtroom. One that will consume careers, reputations, and perhaps even lives. Because when you go after Donald Trump, you'd better be prepared for what comes next. This isn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. This is about power. Who has it, who abuses it, and who ultimately pays the price for their arrogance. And as the gavel strikes and the courtroom erupts into chaos, one thing becomes clear. This legal battle is far from over. In fact, it's only just begun. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as the judge's ruling sank in. For Donald Trump, a man accustomed to commanding attention and bending the rules of the game to his will, this moment was a bitter pill to swallow. But what made it sting even more wasn't just the ruling itself. It was the unmistakable sense that the scales of justice were being tipped, not by evidence or law, but by something far more insidious. Politics. Judge Callaway's decision to admit a piece of evidence that Trump's legal team had vehemently argued was inadmissible wasn't just a procedural blow. It was a signal that this trial wasn't going to be like any other courtroom battle Trump had faced. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about power, perception, and control. And for Trump, it felt like the entire system was conspiring against him. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Alvin Bragg, already infamous for his controversial handling of cases, seemed emboldened by the judge's decision. Bragg had been criticized for downgrading serious felony charges against violent offenders in other cases, yet here he was, throwing the book at Trump with 34 felony charges for actions that many legal experts argued would have been misdemeanors for anyone else. The contrast was glaring, and Trump supporters seized on it as proof of a double standard. Was this justice, or was this retribution? For years, Trump had railed against what he called the deep state, an invisible network of bureaucrats, and officials he claimed were working tirelessly to undermine him. To his critics, it was little more than a conspiracy theory, a convenient scapegoat for his failures. But to his base, it resonated deeply. They saw this trial as the culmination of years of institutional resistance to Trump's presidency, a final attempt to silence him and erase his legacy. And then there was Judge Callaway himself. Appointed during the Obama administration, Callaway had built a reputation as a fair but firm arbiter of the law. But in this case, his impartiality was being called into question. Trump's allies pointed to his past rulings on politically charged cases as evidence of bias, while his detractors praised him for standing up to what they saw as Trump's attempts to bully the judiciary into submission. The courtroom became a microcosm of a deeply divided nation. Outside its walls, protesters clashed in the streets, Trump's supporters waving MAGA flags and chanting slogans about freedom and justice, while his opponents carried signs proclaiming, "No one is above the law." The media circus only added fuel to the fire, with pundits on both sides dissecting every twist and turn in the case with breathless urgency. But beneath all the noise and spectacle lay a deeper truth. This trial wasn't just about Donald Trump. It was about what kind of country America wanted to be. Was it a nation where justice was truly blind, or one where political affiliations determined your fate? For many watching from afar, it felt like an existential moment, a test not just of Trump's resilience, but of the very foundations of American democracy. The unfairness festered like an open wound. Every new development seemed to deepen the divide between those who believed Trump was being persecuted and those who believed he was finally being held accountable. When Judge Callaway denied another motion from Trump's legal team, this time, to delay proceedings due to what they claimed were procedural irregularities, it only added fuel to the fire. To Trump's supporters, this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war against an entrenched elite that had been trying to destroy him since day one. They saw parallels between his fight and their own struggles against what they perceived as an increasingly hostile system, one that prioritized political correctness over fairness, globalism over patriotism, and conformity over individuality. And yet, for all his bluster and bravado, there were moments when even Trump seemed shaken by the weight of it all. Sitting at the defense table as prosecutors laid out their case with surgical precision, he occasionally glanced toward his legal team with an expression that betrayed something rare for him: doubt. But if there's one thing Donald Trump has always understood better than anyone else, it's how to turn adversity into opportunity. And even as the walls seemed to close in around him, he began plotting his next move. Because if there's one thing he couldn't afford to do now, it was lose. What no one in that courtroom realized, not Judge Callaway, not Alvin Bragg, not even Trump himself, was that this trial would soon take a turn no one could have predicted. A turn that would expose truths long buried and force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable questions about power, privilege, and justice in America. Because sometimes when you push too hard against someone like Donald Trump, they push back harder than you ever imagined possible. The courtroom was quiet now, save for the steady hum of whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Donald Trump sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together, his face a mask of defiance. But beneath the surface, the cracks were beginning to show. For all his bravado, all his insistence that this trial was nothing more than a political witch hunt, the weight of it all was pressing down on him. The evidence presented by the prosecution had been damning. Emails, financial records, testimonies from former associates who once sang his praises, but now sought to distance themselves from the man they once called their leader. It wasn't just about the charges anymore. It was about the narrative being spun around him. A narrative that painted him as reckless, deceitful, and above all guilty. As Judge Callaway delivered yet another ruling against his legal team, a decision that allowed the prosecution to introduce additional evidence Trump's lawyers had fought tooth and nail to exclude, Trump felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just a courtroom battle. It was an assault on everything he had built. His empire, his reputation, his legacy, all of it hung in the balance. And for the first time in years, he felt powerless. The media frenzy outside only added to the pressure. Every headline seemed designed to strip him of his identity as a fighter and replace it with one word: defeated. Pundits speculated endlessly about how this trial would end, not just for Trump but for the country itself. Some called it a reckoning, others called it a tragedy. But for Trump, it felt like betrayal. Betrayal by a system he had once mastered, betrayal by people he had trusted, betrayal by a nation he had led. In moments like these, Trump's mind often wandered back to simpler times, times when he was untouchable, when every move he made seemed destined for success. He thought about his early days in business, about the deals that made him a household name. He thought about his time in the White House, about the rallies where thousands cheered his name and held signs proclaiming their loyalty. He thought about his family, his children who had stood by him through every scandal, and wondered if they still believed in him now. But reflection quickly turned to anger. Anger at Judge Callaway for what Trump saw as blatant bias. Anger at Alvin Bragg for orchestrating what he believed was nothing more than a political hit job. Anger at the media for twisting every word he said into something sinister. And most of all, anger at himself for allowing things to spiral this far out of control. It was during one of these moments of despair that Trump made a decision that would change everything. He realized that playing by their rules wasn't going to save him. The system wasn't designed to give him a fair shot. It was designed to break him. And if he wanted to survive this ordeal, he needed to stop fighting defensively and start fighting offensively. His legal team had been urging caution from the start, telling him to stick to the facts, avoid inflammatory statements, and let the process play out. But Trump knew better than anyone that caution wasn't going to win this battle. He needed something bigger, something bold enough to shift the narrative in his favor and remind everyone watching why he had become such a force in American politics. That night, as he sat alone in his private quarters reviewing documents and strategizing with members of his inner circle, Trump made a call to someone who had been quietly working behind the scenes on his behalf since the trial began. The details of their conversation remain unknown to this day, but what followed was nothing short of extraordinary. The next morning, as court resumed and Judge Callaway prepared to hear arguments from both sides regarding yet another procedural motion, Trump's legal team dropped a bombshell, a motion not just challenging Callaway's rulings but accusing him of judicial misconduct. The motion included evidence suggesting that Callaway had ties to organizations openly critical of Trump's presidency, evidence that raised serious questions about his impartiality. The courtroom erupted into chaos as attorneys on both sides argued over whether the motion should even be considered. Judge Callaway himself looked visibly shaken, but maintained his composure as he denied any wrongdoing and insisted on proceeding with the trial as planned. But outside those walls, everything changed in an instant. The story spread like wildfire across social media and news outlets worldwide. Donald Trump wasn't just fighting back. He was taking aim at the very foundation of this case, the judge himself. For Trump's supporters, it was vindication, AEC, sign that their leader hadn't lost his edge despite everything stacked against him. For his critics, it was desperation, a last-ditch effort by a man who couldn't face accountability for his actions. But for Donald Trump, it wasn't about vindication or desperation, it was about survival. Because in that moment, when all seemed lost and defeat felt inevitable, he found something he hadn't felt in weeks: control. And with control came power, the kind of power that could turn even the most hopeless situation into an opportunity for redemption or revenge. The courtroom was electric, the tension palpable as Judge Callaway attempted to regain control of the proceedings. The motion accusing him of judicial misconduct had thrown the trial into disarray, and for the first time since it began, the prosecution looked rattled. Alvin Bragg, who had carried himself with unwavering confidence throughout the case, now wore an expression of unease. The carefully constructed narrative he had built, the one that painted Donald Trump as a man whose arrogance and greed had finally caught up with him, was beginning to crack. Trump sat at the defense table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. He wasn't just observing, he was calculating. For weeks he had endured blow after blow, watching as the prosecution presented damning evidence and witnesses who seemed determined to bury him. But now, the tables were turning. And what no one in that room realized, not Judge Callaway, not Alvin Bragg, not even Trump's own legal team, was that this reversal wasn't just a lucky break. It was planned. The motion against Judge Callaway wasn't just a desperate attempt to stall the trial. It was a strategic move designed to expose a deeper truth. Trump's team had been quietly gathering information for weeks, digging into Callaway's background and connections. What they uncovered was shocking. Financial contributions from organizations with direct ties to anti-Trump advocacy groups, emails suggesting private conversations with individuals who had publicly criticized Trump's presidency, and even records of meetings that raised serious questions about his impartiality. When Trump's lead attorney presented this evidence in court, the room erupted into chaos. The prosecution immediately objected, calling the accusations baseless and accusing Trump's team of trying to derail the trial. But the damage was done. The judge's reputation, once untouchable, was now under scrutiny, and every decision he had made in this case was being questioned. For Trump's supporters, this revelation was nothing short of vindication. They had long believed that the system was rigged against him, that powerful forces were working behind the scenes to ensure his downfall. And now they had proof, or at least enough to cast doubt on the fairness of the proceedings. But it wasn't just Judge Callaway who found himself in hot water. As Trump's team continued to present their findings, they revealed something even more explosive, evidence suggesting collusion between members of the prosecution and outside political organizations, with a vested interest in seeing Trump convicted. Emails and text messages showed coordination between Bragg's office and these groups, discussions about strategy, media narratives, and even potential witnesses. Alvin Bragg tried to dismiss these revelations as irrelevant, insisting that they had no bearing on the charges against Trump. But his voice lacked its usual conviction. The courtroom could sense it, the shift in power dynamics, the unraveling of control he had worked so hard to maintain. And then came the moment that changed everything. Trump's legal team introduced a witness, a former associate of Alvin Bragg, who had come forward with information that sent shockwaves through the courtroom. This individual claimed to have first-hand knowledge of conversations within Bragg's office about how to handle Trump's case, not based on evidence or legal precedent but on political optics. According to their testimony, Bragg had allegedly expressed concerns about how a conviction, or lack thereof, would impact his own career and standing within his party. The prosecution immediately tried to discredit the witness, calling their motives into question and accusing them of being manipulated by Trump's team. But their words fell flat. The witness was calm, composed, and unwavering in their account, a stark contrast to Bragg's increasingly defensive demeanor. For Donald Trump, this moment was more than just a turning point. It was validation. Validation that his instincts had been right all along, that this trial wasn't about justice but about power. And now that power was shifting. As these revelations unfolded, Judge Callaway announced an emergency recess, a decision that only fueled speculation about his ability to preside over this case impartially. Outside the courtroom, reporters scrambled to cover every angle of the story while protesters on both sides clashed in heated debates about what these developments meant for America. But inside those walls, Donald Trump remained focused. He knew this battle wasn't over yet. There were still charges to fight and narratives to dismantle. But for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt like he was back in control, not just of his own fate, but of the story itself. Because what Alvin Bragg and Judge Callaway hadn't realized until now was that Donald Trump wasn't just a defendant in this trial. He was a master strategist who knew how to turn adversity into opportunity. And as their carefully constructed case began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions, Trump saw an opening, a chance not just to clear his name, but to expose what he believed was a corrupt system designed to silence him. The stakes couldn't be higher. The emotional tension couldn't be greater. And yet somehow Donald Trump thrived in this chaos. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving a point, that no matter how powerful his enemies thought they were, he would always find a way to outmaneuver them. And as he sat there watching Alvin Bragg struggle to salvage what remained of his case while Judge Callaway faced mounting pressure from both sides, one thing became clear. This trial wasn't going according to their plan anymore. It was going according to his. The courtroom was packed for what everyone knew would be the final day of this explosive trial. The air was thick with anticipation, and the nation was watching, waiting to see how it would all end. Judge Calloway, visibly worn from the mounting scrutiny, entered the room with a somber expression. His gavel struck, but it no longer carried the same authority it once did. The revelations about his connections and questionable impartiality had shattered his credibility, and even he seemed to understand that his role in this case was coming to an end. Alvin Bragg sat stiffly at the prosecution table, his confidence now replaced with unease. The once celebrated district attorney had become a symbol of overreach and political gamesmanship. His carefully curated case had unraveled before his eyes, and with it, his reputation. The evidence of collusion, the damning testimony from his former associate, and the growing public perception that this trial had been more about settling scores than seeking justice had left him cornered. He had underestimated Donald Trump, and now he was paying the price. Trump, on the other hand, exuded a quiet confidence. He wasn't gloating, at least not outwardly, but there was a sense of vindication in his demeanor. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle anymore. It was about proving that he could withstand everything thrown at him and still come out on top. For weeks he had been painted as a man on the brink of ruin, but now the narrative had shifted. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. As proceedings began, Trump's legal team delivered their closing arguments with precision and force. They didn't just dismantle the prosecution's case, they turned it into an indictment of the very system that had sought to bring Trump down. They spoke of bias, of political motivations masquerading as justice, and of a double standard that threatened to erode public trust in institutions meant to be impartial. It wasn't just a defense, it was an offense, a challenge to anyone who dared to use their power unfairly. When it was Alvin Bragg's turn to speak, he struggled to regain control of the narrative. His arguments felt hollow, his words lacking the conviction they once carried. The jury watched him with skeptical eyes, their expressions betraying doubt. The damage had been done and no amount of rhetoric could undo it, and then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The verdict. The jury filed back into the room after hours of deliberation, their faces unreadable. The foreperson stood and delivered their decision, not guilty on all counts. The room erupted. Cheers from Trump's supporters mingled with gasps from his detractors. Outside the courthouse, crowds reacted with equal fervor, jubilation on one side, outrage on the other. But inside that courtroom, Donald Trump remained composed. He didn't need to celebrate, the verdict spoke for itself. But justice didn't stop there. In the days that followed, Judge Calloway announced his resignation amid mounting calls for an investigation into his conduct during the trial. His legacy as a fair and impartial jurist lay in ruins, tarnished by revelations that he had allowed personal biases to influence his decisions. For someone who had prided himself on upholding the integrity of the judiciary, it was a fall from grace that few could have predicted, but many found deeply satisfying. Alvin Bragg faced an even harsher reckoning. Calls for his resignation grew louder as more details emerged about his office's coordination with outside groups seeking to influence the trial's outcome. Investigations were launched into potential ethical violations, and Bragg found himself at the center of a scandal that threatened not just his career, but also his credibility as a prosecutor. The man who had sought to bring down Donald Trump now found himself fighting for his own survival. For Trump's supporters, these outcomes were nothing short of poetic justice, a reversal of fortune that proved their belief in him wasn't misplaced. To them, this wasn't just about one man's victory. It was about exposing corruption and holding those in power accountable for their actions. But perhaps the most striking moment came during Trump's first public appearance after the trial. Standing before a crowd of thousands at one of his signature rallies, he spoke not with anger or vengeance, but with resolve. "They tried to break us," he said, his voice steady but firm. "They tried to silence us because they thought we were too strong, too loud, too different from what they wanted us to be. But we showed them something they'll never forget. You can't crush people who refuse to back down." The crowd roared its approval as Trump continued. "This wasn't just my fight. It was our fight," he said. "And we didn't just win today. We set an example for every American who's ever felt like they were up against a system rigged against them. It was a message that resonated far beyond that rally, a message of resilience in the face of adversity and defiance against those who abuse their power. As Donald Trump walked off that stage under a sky lit up by cheers and flashing cameras, one thing became clear. Whether you loved him or hated him, you couldn't deny that he had once again defied expectations and emerged victorious. For Judge Callaway and Alvin Bragg, and for anyone else who thought they could use their positions to tilt the scales, this trial served as a stark reminder. Karma doesn't play favorites, and sometimes justice doesn't just level the playing field, it flips it entirely. Trump didn't need revenge because justice had already been served in ways more profound than any act of retaliation could achieve. He walked away not just acquitted but emboldened, with something far greater than vindication. Proof that even when everything seems stacked against you, there's always a way forward if you're willing to fight for it. And as America watched this saga come to its dramatic conclusion, one question lingered in everyone's minds. What happens next? Because if there's one thing Donald Trump has proven time and again, it's that his story is never truly over.